Since the war in Iran kicks off, we've seen a whole load of headlines about the decline of the so-called petrodollar. Even reputable outlets like Bloomberg and the Financial Times have turned their attention to a topic that's usually the preserve of armchair geostrategists on YouTube. And it's an idea that the Iranians themselves are apparently leaning into, with CNN reporting in March that Iran was considering only allowing oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz if their cargoes were priced in Chinese yuan, in order to, quote, destabilize the petrodollar. So in this video, we're going to explain what the petrodollar actually is, and whether it's under threat. Hint, the answer is yes, but probably not for the reasons you think it is. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's start by explaining what petrodollars actually are. In short, petrodollars are US dollars received by oil exporting countries in exchange for their crude oil. Oil exporting countries generally earn dollars for their exports because the oil trade is generally denominated in dollars. In other words, if you want to buy a barrel of oil in the international markets, chances are you'll have to pay for it with dollars. Now, some people claim that the mere fact that the global oil trade is denominated in dollars is a big reason that the US dollar is the world's most popular currency. Or more specifically, the world's so-called reserve currency. That is, the currency that central banks and other financial institutions like to hold in reserve. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency endows the US with certain structural advantages. It creates extra demand for dollars and dollar-denominated assets like US government debt, for instance, allowing the US government to borrow lots of money and run large budget deficits. That means that the US can unilaterally impose sanctions on other countries by denying them access to the dollar-based financial system. Anyway, the idea here seems to be that the dollar is popular because you need dollars to buy oil, and everyone needs oil, so everyone needs dollars. For what it's worth, we think this dynamic is overstated. Pricing oil in dollars probably helps the dollar a bit, insofar as it reinforces the idea that the dollar is the default currency for international trade. But the idea that you somehow need dollars to buy oil just isn't really true anymore. This is in part because at least some oil exporters, like Russia, price their oil in other currencies. But it's mainly because, thanks to deep and well-developed financial markets, it is today pretty easy to buy oil in other major currencies, even if the underlying contract is denominated in dollars. It's also worth noting that oil is less central to the global economy than it used to be, as evidenced by worldwide declines in oil intensity, which basically measures how much oil is required to produce a unit of GDP. The point we're trying to make is that today, you really don't need dollars to buy oil, nor does everyone need as much oil as they used to, which should cast some doubt on the idea that the mere fact that oil is priced in dollars is somehow central to the dollar's global appeal. There is, however, a different way in which petrodollars have buttressed the dollar in the past, which has probably had more of a significant impact on its enduring status as the world's reserve currency, and that's via a process known as petrodollar recycling. In short, petrodollar recycling is when oil exporting countries spend their petrodollars on US assets, and specifically US government bonds, commonly known as treasuries. This process was codified in 1974 via a secret agreement between Saudi Arabia and the US that essentially required the Saudis to spend their petrodollars on treasuries in exchange for an implicit security guarantee. This had a meaningful impact on the dollar's reserve status, because this semi-artificial demand for treasuries allowed the US to run large budget deficits, and helped establish treasuries as the world's favourite form of debt. Treasury status as the world's favourite form of debt, and the dollar's status as the world's favourite currency, ultimately became mutually reinforcing. The dollar's popularity made treasuries more appealing, because treasuries could be sold for dollars and paid dollar interest, while treasuries' popularity made the dollar more appealing because, well, you need dollars to buy treasuries. Now, petrodollar recycling was a big thing in the 70s and early 80s, because as global oil prices surged, oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE were suddenly flush with dollars, but they couldn't really spend this money at home because their domestic economies just weren't developed enough to cope with such massive inflows. This left them sitting on huge surpluses, which they then recycled into treasuries. However, petrodollar recycling isn't as much of a thing these days, for two reasons. First, lots of oil exporters aren't actually running massive surpluses anymore. The Saudis are probably the best example of this. While they still rake in a lot of money for oil exports, the difference with the 70s is that today they're also spending a lot of money as they try and diversify away from oil. This means that the Saudis just don't have as much spare cash to invest in treasuries, as evidenced by the fact that they've been running both fiscal and trade deficits for the past couple of years. Second, there's evidence to suggest that those exporters that are still running large surpluses aren't buying as many treasuries as they used to. You can see this if you just look at how treasuries have moved in the past couple of weeks. Usually during oil crises, treasuries go up, both because oil exporters start recycling their revenues into treasuries, and because treasuries used to be considered the archetypal safe asset, which means that demand goes up during times of turmoil. This time, however, this hasn't happened, and treasuries have actually sold off, with the yield on 30-year bonds rising from 4.6% when the war started to more like 4.9% today. But this is a symptom more than a cause. In other words, the apparent demise of petrodollar recycling doesn't present some sort of acute risk to either the treasury market or the dollar's reserve status. After all, things have been moving in this direction on and off since oil prices collapsed in the 80s, with no visible impact on either treasuries or the dollar's reserve status. Rather, the ongoing demise of petrodollar recycling more reflects the fact that, well, treasuries don't look that safe anymore, for wider, more structural reasons like America's massive outstanding debt pile and the Trump administration's ongoing assault on the Federal Reserve. This speaks to a more general misunderstanding in the petrodollar discourse. If the petrodollar, whatever we mean by that, is dying, then it'll be a symptom rather than the cause of a more general malaise in the treasury and dollar markets. Keeping up to date with stories like these and doing independent journalism requires a lot of constant research from across all corners of the internet, and even sometimes calls for international travel. It's not uncommon that we then come across roadblocks, whether that be dubious-looking websites that claim to be safe, dodgy Wi-Fi connections in airports or cafes, or even region-locked articles. We couldn't get past any of these barriers without a trusted VPN, so that's where NordVPN comes into play. That's because NordVPN not only offers you the fastest VPN on the planet, giving you quick and secure streaming wherever you are, but also keeps you safe from all of the suspicious corners of the internet. NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro feature is built to protect you by blocking dangerous ads, stopping you from entering malware hosting websites, and running through checks on everything you download. If anything is found to be infected or dangerous, the files are removed before they can harm you. But if you're rightfully concerned about your life before NordVPN, they've still got you covered. Their dark web monitor will be constantly scanning the seedy underbelly of the internet, even when you're not connected to a VPN, and will alert you if any of your old data or passwords have been sold. From there, NordPass will give your old passwords a huge upgrade and keep them all in one place for you to easily and safely manage. In today's world, we couldn't imagine even just existing on the internet without a VPN. So there's no better time to take your internet safety seriously. So if your internet safety is as important to you as it is to us, you can sign up to NordVPN today. Simply click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR. And not only will you get a massive discount, but you'll also get 4 extra months totally free. There's no better time to protect yourself. So once again, that's nordvpn.com/TLDR, and it's completely risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee.